Whether someone sings in corporate worship probably has very little to do with how they feel about the songs themselves. It has everything to do with how they feel about their voices. I heard stories from men who feel like their voices intrude on a Sunday morning because they're so low. It takes a lot of confidence for someone with a low, loud voice to sing out when they feel like there's a quiet moment. Men who were made fun of as their voices changed in adolescence, who are made fun of for having lower voices, who are made fun of for having unpolished voices.
Churchfront Conference of 2024 audience, please welcome my friend, Kelsey McGinnis.
So I spend a lot of time researching, reporting on, writing about congregational music pretty broadly. And almost every article I write starts with a question. Not an interview question, there are always a lot of those, but most of them start with like a big picture kind of question. Most of the time they start with the wrong question, embarrassingly. Sometimes they start with a very bad question, actually. What do I mean by a very bad question? I'll give you an example. Why aren't men singing in church? Why is this a bad question? This is a confrontational question, and it assumes something that I think you and I know is not true, that men aren't singing in church. Now, to be fair, this question was posed rhetorically to me during a conversation that stuck with me. The person asking wasn't really asking. They had in mind a problem that they wanted to talk about. They had in mind a diagnosis about that problem as well, some problems that they thought they were observing, and maybe they had a friend or two who affirmed, oh, I'm seeing that too. Why aren't more men singing in church? Why are so many men not singing in church? Now, despite this being a pretty bad question, and not really an honest question, it was the starting point for this story. Now, I'll admit that title is a little bit provocative, but the process of reporting out this article took me from a silly question through a series of better and harder questions that in the end changed the way I think about how we relate to our voices as worshipers. So I started digging into this story because the question, why aren't men singing in church, is not particularly helpful, but I had been mulling over a story about something like this for a while. If you, like me, spend much time in Christian spaces online, on social media, you know that a conversation about something like this comes up every once in a while. It's sort of a perennial concern and discussion about the intersection between masculinity, singing, contemporary worship music, and emotions. And this discourse tends to take on different flavors every time it comes up. Sometimes you'll see the term effeminate used over and over. Sometimes you'll see an old cliche that's been around for like 25 years, like Jesus is my boyfriend music, or love songs to Jesus, or something like that. I'm sure you've all heard these. Every once in a while, a pastor will have a viral tweet about how if you want men to sing in your church, you should be doing 4-part hymnody. You should be singing from a hymnal. There's something inherently more masculine about hymns. So it comes up over and over again, and I had sort of written it off as online rage baiting for a while. But as it kept coming up, I got more and more curious about it. Is there actually a question here that's worth exploring? Is there a good question? Is there a wiser question here somewhere? So I turned this over in my head for a while, and I just couldn't quite figure out what the right question might be. So I called someone who I thought might be able to help me ask the better question. I called Dr. Randall Bradley, who is the director of the Baylor Men's Choir. He is also a really experienced choir director and worship leader in his own right. And just wanted to ask him some questions. What am I seeing here? What are we seeing online? And I was sort of trying to trace back as a music historian. I can look back at the ways that singing or certain instruments are gendered in certain ways. Was that the right question? Is there a question here about musical style and emotional expression? Is there something to the claim that men would rather sing 4-part hymns? I don't know. So I asked these questions of Dr. Bradley, and he spends a lot of time with men who like to sing, men who want to become better singers, and men who don't think of themselves as particularly musical at all. And we talked for a long time, And he shared so much insight with me and helped me see that the questions I was trying to ask were far, far too impersonal. They were far too theoretical. They were far too online. He helped me realize that the question I should be asking is about our relationship with our own voices. And I almost get choked up talking about it now because there was this moment during the conversation when I realized how personal and tender that issue actually is, and I had been going at it the wrong way. Whether someone sings in corporate worship probably has very little to do with how they feel about the songs themselves. It has everything to do with how they feel about their voices. Dr. Bradley told me that the men in his choir will gladly sing music that was written last year or 100 years ago. They don't complain about effeminate or overly emotional songs. They like hymnody, they like new songs. They sing ecumenically and they love it all. But whether or not they sing in corporate worship has to do with how they feel about their voice. I heard stories from men and from Dr. Bradley about men who were made fun of as their voices changed in adolescence, who were made fun of for having lower voices, who were made fun of for having unpolished voices, and then for years just didn't sing, ever. Never thought of themselves as a vocalist. I heard stories from men who feel like their voices intrude on a Sunday morning because they're so low. It takes a lot of confidence for someone with a low, loud voice to sing out when they feel like there's a quiet moment that's sort of exclusively for tenors and altos. And that's something I had never had to think about as a female vocalist. I have never had to navigate a sudden voice change. I was never made fun of for singing passionately or emotionally, and I've always felt like my voice has a place in the music of the church. A couple of the students in the Baylor Men's Choir who I got to talk to told me that if they hadn't have had a mentor in their teenage years to walk them through change and to continue affirming their love of singing and the beauty of their voices, that their voices had value, they might have stopped singing altogether and just thought that singing wasn't for them, even in the context of congregational worship. So it turns out if you feel like your voice is a gift, that it has a place, you're more likely to offer it as a sacrifice of praise. And if you feel like your voice doesn't matter or doesn't have a place, or might even sort of get in the way of the aesthetic of the offering that's being offered here, you're a lot more likely to be quiet. I share that story as an example because it's an example of moving toward a better question about the music we're singing and about what's happening in our congregations. A lot of the time, the best questions aren't about the music itself. They're about what's happening in a particular community of people. Now, I'm not someone who works in ministry. I volunteer, but it's pretty limited. And so when I was asked to speak here, I found myself thinking, okay, what can I offer here that would be useful to you all? Because you all in this room are my resources. You all are the people who I call when I'm reporting on a story to tell me what you're dealing with on the ground, what problems your communities are trying to fix or address. I rely on people like you in my research. So when I thought about what I could offer that might be helpful, I thought maybe that this process from moving toward my very bad first question toward a better question about what's happening in the worship of the church, maybe that could help you all think differently about the questions that come up as you do ministry in your own contexts. So I'd like to walk through a couple more examples of my bad question to good question research process. So here's another one. Is it more boring to be a church drummer than it was 20 years ago? We can have a discussion about this later, drummers. This seems like a weirdly specific question, and it kind of is. Over the course of a week, the drummer at my own church and then a drummer that I was talking to in Atlanta for a story both said to me, gosh, my job is so much more boring than it used to be. It's gotten so much more boring. The music is more boring. And it kind of stuck with me because that was a strangely specific thing to hear from two people from different parts of the country, different ages, different kinds of churches, but playing some of the same kinds of music. So I got curious about what might be going on there. Now, I'm not a drummer. And I know that sometimes griping about the particulars of musical style can just sort of come with the territory of being a musician. But I decided to try to go down this rabbit hole. Now, why is this a bad question? Well, the obvious reason is that what anyone finds boring is entirely subjective, right? There's not a great way for me to prove that more drummers, 4 out of 10 drummers, say that their job is more boring than it was 20 years ago. That's not very useful information anyway. So I got on the phone with a musicologist colleague who studies the stylistic changes in contemporary worship music over the past 30 years, and we talked about how today's most popular worship music tends to draw from EDM, from electronic dance music, for its sort of style characteristics, as opposed to 30 years ago, you would have found something a little bit more like straight-ahead rock. There are certain technologies that have made their way into more churches, like click. You hear a lot more pads, you have access to loops, and a lot of these technologies are easier to get and use and cheaper than they once were. And that has changed the musical landscape of the church in some really interesting ways. So after that conversation, it became clear to me that the question here is probably not about boredom, but probably just about change. So maybe a better question might be, what has changed in the past 20 years for drummers? And has anything meaningful been lost in that change? Is there anything that has sort of slipped away without us noticing? So I called a bunch of musicians who have served as church drummers for over a decade. I looked for veteran church drummers and talked to a bunch of them. And I asked them, how has your job changed? What are you having to learn? What are you having to stop doing? Tell me the good, the bad, what you wish was different. A couple answers really stuck out to me. One veteran drummer talked about how playing with click actually lets him be more than a glorified metronome, and he really enjoys that, actually. He likes that his job now has a lot more to do with supporting the tone and the emotional arc of a song. He feels like he gets to be more creative. It's not just about setting and keeping a groove. He feels like he gets to be more expressive and that he's gotten to develop these different musical skills as he's grown. But it wasn't all good. I did talk to another musician who said, at his church, with the style of music they're gravitating toward now, he just doesn't really feel needed. He feels like everyone would be fine if he just wasn't there. It's all about the loops. It's all about the tracks. It's about ambient sounds, the vocals. He doesn't feel like he's being guided into what a new role might be. He feels like, increasingly, he's sitting behind an instrument that might be becoming kind of obsolete. Now, for me, this is where we start moving to a better question, because now we're out of the weeds of musical style and logistics, and we're into questions, again, of relationship and community. Now, I could talk all day about the ways that technology changes music making, not just in the church. I'll take off my reporter, writer hat for a minute and put on my musicologist hat. And I teach a lot of courses on music history and theology, and pop music history, and we spend a ton of time talking about the ways that technology changes music, the way that advances in technology from instruments to recording technology to printing have changed the nature of music making in community with other people. And a lot of the time, those advances bring new opportunities for creativity. We adapt, we bring them into our music making. But new technologies also threaten us with obsolescence. New technology is almost always accompanied by panic. You can find so many examples of this throughout history. New technology is almost always accompanied by panic because being obsolete is a terrifying prospect for a human and for a musician. So back to our better, thornier question. How has technology changed the role of a drummer? We might also ask, how do style shifts and technologies change? How do we let them change in the church without pushing people aside? How can music ministry become a place where people can grow and where they aren't expendable? All of this, for me, gets at a question that is about a lot more than music. It's about how the church can be the rare place in this world where a person never becomes obsolete. Music ministry is a great sandbox for that conversation about how people can get pushed out of leadership in the church, because there's always something new. There's always some new music, some new technology, new people coming in who are eager to serve. So leaders are always grappling with how to deal with the new. And I recognize that this is really complicated. I get to be the armchair researcher up here. I'm not the one on the ground dealing with the people, dealing with the fallout of this, the choir director, the church organist. About a month ago, I was at the Sing conference in Nashville, which is hosted by Keith and Kristen Getty. And one of the first things I noticed about that conference was the demographic. There were over 6,000 people there in the room, and I would say over half of them were over the age of 60, which I found to be really interesting. I spoke with at least 5 retired church choir directors, and they said that one thing that draws them to that particular conference is that it's a place where they don't feel obsolete. They don't feel like they've aged out. There are hymns and modern hymns, there's choral music, they get to use their music reading chops. They feel like they have a place again. Now, I am not here to make any grand pronouncements about how much change is too much or what the right rate of change is in a church. That's such a specific question to every particular church community. And I'm certainly not going to answer that question with an insightful article. But after all of these conversations and writing this piece, I came away wanting myself to be part of a community where people aren't primarily valued for their ability to serve a particular aesthetic. I want to be part of a community where people don't age out by default, where we don't let them age out by default, where they can choose to grow and be part of the changes that they see happening around them that they know they can't stop, but we can let them be a part of those changes. So maybe if you have a drummer who's complaining about being bored with the music, they might have also a growing suspicion that their training, their abilities, their tastes and preferences even are becoming obsolete. Every drummer I talked to was eager to learn new skills and to grow into a new role and to grow along with the church and change with it. But the ones who were feeling left behind were the ones who just didn't feel like they knew where to go and weren't being guided in a new way forward. Here's a slightly related question. Should churches use live autotune? This question gets posed to me a lot. Now, I'll usually say should questions are not good questions. They invite a simple yes or no. There are lots of better ways of talking about a technology like autotune. Now, I'm going to use an example of an article that I did not write. My colleague from Religion News Service, Bob Smetana, wrote this one. The conversation around autotune is fascinating to me. I know, I love the subtitle there. Now, there are so many different ways and so many different layers to this conversation, right? There's sort of like your basic TikTok take, which is all these singers are fooling you. They all use autotune and pitch correction. They're all lying to you. This is an issue of integrity. But then there's the reality that when you're streaming a service, if you don't have some kind of autotune and pitch correction going, those vocals are going to sound rough. You're not, even with the best team, they're going to sound pretty rough. The quotes that Bob got for this article are actually really helpful and lay out a variety of ways of talking about what this particular technology can do. He spoke to an audio engineer who described autotune as spell check, or like having bumpers at the bowling alley. Someone else said that its effects are kind of like using a click. They keep everyone together, but instead of in terms of tempo, in terms of pitch, which I thought was a helpful parallel. But then Bob talked to a professor from Belmont who warned, I suppose, if we're not careful, we're going to turn our churches into, quote, what was his quote, karaoke franchises, was the term that he used. So that's the worry, right? The worry is that we're going to go too far, that we're going to start using too much technology and we're going to cross some magical threshold where we are too far from what we're actually supposed to be doing. Too far from what, though? Too far toward what? Too far in what direction? When we talk about the threat or danger of too much technology, what are we really worried about? Why does it bother us to think that our favorite singer might not be singing for real, whatever real might be? And why do we feel entitled to someone's real or untreated voice? What's that about? When we talk about the threat or danger of too much technology, I would suggest it has something to do with our reaction to AI art. Among the many things that I do not like about AI art is that there is no other human being on the other side of that work. I want art that helps me know and understand another human being. Art is for a lot of things, but one thing it's really good at is cultivating empathy and cultivating relationship and giving me insight into the reality of another human being. That's part of the value of art. And it helps us see the creativity of God in the creativity of another human being. And a human voice is part of that creativity. It's part of that whole human being. The audible perfections and uniqueness in every voice is part of their humanity. It's part of their body. It reminds me that there's a person that's really there, that is embodied, and that they aren't a robot, right? But an amplified voice is already a modified voice. What about reverb? At what point is a voice so treated that we start to lose sight of someone's humanity? That's a pretty big meta question. I don't have a great answer to that. We're sort of down a theoretical rabbit hole. But I happen to like this particular theoretical rabbit hole because it gets at this question. How do we balance humanity and imperfection with our desire to create something excellent? I think that's a really good question to ask. It's a much better question than should we be using Autotune, because it's not really about Autotune. It's about what we want and expect technology to do for us. Has music ministry become a singular pursuit of perceived excellence to the point that you are willing to plug in technologies to mask the uniqueness of the musicians on your stage? What are you using it for? What's the purpose? Now, I'm not going to naively suggest that mistakes and poor tuning are not distracting. I am also, like all of you, distracted by mistakes and poor tuning. But if distraction is the primary thing that you're worried about, I'd invite you deeper down into this rabbit hole and ask, why would the imperfection of another human voice be so distracting to me? Why would encountering the imperfection in another person's music making be so uncomfortable? And is my discomfort actually just a lack of grace and a lack of love for the person that I see on stage? Maybe. One of the drummers that I spoke with for the Is Drumming Boring story said, quote, "I think contemporary worship is in its Vogue magazine era. It's the photoshopped version of itself." Now, some of these technologies are ways of making our music a little bit glossier, smoother, tighter. Sometimes it's more comfortable to confront the photoshopped version of ourselves, of our community. Community can be uncomfortable. I think one radical thing that the church can do is be a place where we can model acceptance of the awkwardness and perfection from time to time that comes about when you allow people to create something together, right? That's part of our humanity. And that's something that the church can model and be accepting of where the world is not. Speaking of bringing all of our humanity to our worship. Ooh, do I have a last question up here? No, I don't. Well, I'll just pose this last question if we can kill the video. Speaking of bringing all of our humanity into worship, a question that comes up a lot in my reporting is, how do we make space for lament in our worship? There seems to be a really widespread sense that the most popular worship music of our time does not give adequate space for lament, that it camps out on joy, of blessedness, outpourings of worship, or contented meditations on the goodness of God. All good things. I've not yet spoken with any worship leader who would say that we're definitely doing enough lament in the context of our worship music. No one seems to have found that sweet spot yet. Now, the question of how, this isn't necessarily a bad question. How can we find more space for lament? I think the question of how to logistically lament together as we sing is a relevant one. I have a story that I was going to show you all about making space for music that deals with trauma and issues of mental health, which are heavy issues to try to address during a Sunday morning service. And for this story, I spoke with Matt Maher, songwriter and worship leader, about the emotional whiplash of trying to allow space for that during a worship service and how challenging that can be. He talked about how it can really disrupt the emotional arc, and dealing with that problem is very difficult. But I'm not convinced that these logistical challenges are the reason why we don't make space for lament. One of the people I talked to for this story is both a songwriter and worship leader and a labor and delivery nurse, which I think is an incredible combination. And speaking with her about the process of writing a lament made me wonder what people mean when they say they want more lament. A better question might be, what are we going to lament? What do we want to lament? What do we actually need to lament? Before thinking about how to make space for lament, we might think about what our community wants to say together. Of course, there's always a need for confession and for dealing with our own brokenness as a body, for lamenting our fallenness. But lament is also responsive. It's a way of letting our corporate worship respond to the hurt in our community and outside of the church walls. So perhaps the better question is, what hurt, what suffering do we want to respond to in our worship? And what does that look like? It requires looking to the hurt in your congregation, beyond the church, and it requires the church to lean into the community around and respond in song, which I think is increasingly a rare way to think about what our musical worship is actually for. I like ending on this question and this issue because I think the better version pushes us to be shaped by, and to let our worship be shaped by, love of our neighbors as opposed to love of excellence. So I hope that this was helpful, moving from bad question to better question. We so often are looking for easy or clear answers about music, production, putting a service together. We like categories. We like good, bad, singable, not singable, sacred, secular. We like those little boxes for what we're doing here. I am amazed that every semester in one of my classes, I have a student who asks me about frequencies. Are there actually frequencies that can heal depression or lessen my anxiety or improve my mental health? We want something quantifiable. We want something that music can do for us that we can prove. And in my view, that's a really superstitious way of thinking about what music can actually do. Music has a lot of different potential functions, but none of them are magic, and not all of them work that way. These meanings are not static across faith communities. Most of the important questions about musical worship have to be answered and dealt with in community by asking sometimes really hard and uncomfortable questions. My job, I think, is to help identify good questions and to tell stories about how communities are answering those questions together. It is really easy to have a take on any worship-related thing, to have a take that translates well to online discourse. But it's a lot harder to tell stories and go down the rabbit holes that will help us find better and wiser questions.